I've had a rather unusual life, walking around India as a monk in the early days, to becoming a partner with one of the top jewelers in the world. I developed a process for doing semi-precious stone mosaic work. We used to decorate palaces, and so you cruise around in a private jet and you meet all these people. And there is this like really completely erroneous notion that the general public have, that if I actually attained this level of extreme wealth and all opportunity was available to me to have and do anything that I want, any time that I want, somehow my life will be fabulous. And something that's really astonishing, not really astonishing, it's actually very sad, is the pervasiveness of drug and alcohol abuse amongst this elite section of society, where people's idea of one-upmanship is to have 200 cars in your garage. I mean, like the Sultan of Brunei, I stood there under the palace one time and counted how many cars while I was waiting for the driver to come and pick me up. And that was just one. Then he had another one. I mean, every time he opened a new, American auto magazine and he saw the latest Rambler or the latest whatever, and then he calls the ambassador and says, I'd like to order one of these things, and this is the kind of trimmings I want, this is what I want, and it's custom done, and it's bulletproofed, and it's put on a plane and flown in its own plane to Brunei and becomes 201. And, I mean, you can't drive them all, and the place is so dinky and tiny, a spin around the kingdom probably only take you about 2.5 hours, and then what? So I am not just speaking from a philosophical level, nor am I speaking just to do with my personal experience and discovery in my spiritual journey, but it is something that you can practically and in reality see by having the opportunity to really see things on all these different levels. So the current predicament that we find ourselves in, the foundation for it is materialism, this wrong, completely erroneous notion or idea that the body I have is me. And then the quest to seek happiness and fulfillment through this particular vehicle. When we are rooted, when we're founded in this misunderstanding and this idea, and society becomes very shaped by it, it is so easy to go so far off track that it's like people almost cannot find their way back. A really interesting example. Most people think that I am independent, I am strong, I can make up my own mind, I have my own ideas, and there is a complete lack of recognition of how much we are really deeply influenced by the ideas of others. We live in a time that is the product of a most amazing experiment. The experiment with consumer economics, where an idea was developed, an idea of how the general masses of people could be utilized to generate profit, but it was necessary to have them develop certain ways of thinking. And we saw this begin on many different levels in the very, very early 1900s. The ideas of economic theory. And separately, we saw in America this amazing transformation that people today are completely, entirely unaware of. In the very early 1900s, there was a guy, he was a nephew of Freud, Sigmund Freud. His name was Edward Bernays, and he lived in America, and he became so influential. I mean, now we have this, whole Anzac thing and, the disaster of what war is and what it's all about. And if you consider and you understand the history and you see how things are shaped, it's really quite amazing. This Edward Bernays became very close to what's his name? Truman, was it? No, who was the president at the time? Roosevelt? I can't remember. At the time, and America was very resistant to get into the First World War. And so Edward Bernays was employed by the US government to convince Americans to join the war. It was a very unpopular idea. And the techniques that they applied for manipulation of the masses was called in those days propaganda. And Eddie Bernays did an amazing job, and Americans in general embraced the idea and gladly went to war. But actually the people that were really driving it were the big industrialists, because the opportunity to constantly and endlessly create things that have been blown up and then needing to create more things to fill their space is just like, wow, this is like an economic miracle. And so he was highly successful. He was highly successful then in going with that American president to Europe and spreading ideas related to democracy. At that time, in the early 1900s, the idea amongst the people that sort of like ruled everything was that the masses of people are dangerous and that you need to find ways to control them, even within the budding democracies. And immediately after the war, it was like so successful. Eddie Bernays, though, he was thinking, because propaganda was something that was used repeatedly by the Germans, and so it developed a really bad name. And so he wanted to come up with a new title for propaganda, something else he could use that was so benign and acceptable to people at large. You know the name he came up with? Public relations. He invented the term public relations to replace the use of propaganda. And he was approached by the industrialists to transform America from being a needs-based population where people buy things that they just need to a desires or wants-based population. This was a really focused attempt to do this. So at the time, we had one of the leading bankers in America in 1920. His name was Paul Mazur. He was from Lehman Brothers. And he published a work. There was all this discussion going on amongst the elites about it. And he stated, we must shift America from a needs to a desires-based culture. People must be trained to desire, to want things even before the old has been entirely consumed. We must shape a new mentality in America. Man's desires must overshadow his needs. Is this shocking or not? Or it's not a big deal for you guys? I don't know. For me, it's utterly, it's amazing how things come about because of as a product of actual thoughtfulness. And if you do not lead a life that is thoughtful and introspective, the chances of you by accident actually leading a highly, genuinely productive and worthwhile life, a fulfilling life, it's going to be pretty slim. Most people leave this world wondering what the hell it was all about. They lie on their deathbeds or in a state of sickness and just wonder, what the hell was that? And it is fearful for the majority of people. People do not approach the reality of death with any courage, generally. There is great confusion